Today's session, as I mentioned before, is going to be one of these sort of ask me anything kind of things within the realm of like neuroscience careers, graduate studies, anything that kind of relates to that stuff. And so uh, just go ahead and let me know what your questions are. Feel free to drop them in Zoom chat. Did I have a mentor? If so, was their field in neuroscience? And if that's the case, how did you meet them? So uh, I guess we'd have to kind of go back to like undergrad for that, because in theory, like if you're trying to figure out your way in a particular field, you want to get to know all your professors and preferably somebody who's in a field of your general interest. Um, I would say for undergrad, I actually didn't. And it's tricky because I was at a school that had 50,000 students. Compare that to Oxy's 2,000. It was rather absurd, right? It was spread across four different campuses that we needed to travel using buses to get through different parts of town or different towns. This was Rutgers over in New Jersey, for reference. They probably have like 50% more students now at this point. So it's kind of absurd. But I think because of the large class sizes, it hindered me from trying to get to know my professor, and it didn't incentivize me to do it either. My earlier experiences with that, especially like when I took chemistry courses, they didn't care about the students at all. It was bad. There's a whole other thing that like historically was off with the chem department back in the day. But anyway, to your point about mentors, I do think it's important to try to establish that within your undergraduate tenure. I did do research, but I wouldn't. I think the relationship I had with the people I did research under, it wasn't close enough to really call them mentors. It's more like I did some stuff in their lab. They wrote me a recommendation letter, and I kind of went from there. Ideally, you want to have a better contact and rapport than that, because mine was actually pretty lacking, especially considering that the bar is probably a little bit higher these days. So do keep that in mind. But for neuroscience related focus, I would say that my graduate school advisor was also a really good mentor. Very chill, easygoing, still expected you to do like certain types of work, checked in, all that sort of stuff. But he was not a helicopter mom, as they call that. So I think it's important that if you have somebody that's overseeing your research or your work in some way, that if your job works towards independent research or being an independent researcher, what they should be doing is giving you the room to breathe and think. Uh, and some mentors don't really do that. They try to like, it's kind of like the difference between watering a cactus versus like attending to a bonsai plant. It's some people get a little bit too involved. And then when you're on your own, if you had a mentor that's too involved, it's just really, really tricky to kind of figure out how to do things on your own. Whereas my mentor was just involved enough, but gave me a lot of space to kind of figure things out on my own. So I think that was super helpful. As for how I met them, it was through applying to grad school, honestly. But I think, again, the ideal is that you try to meet a mentor before you do the grad school thing at all. And then you will have like other mentors as you go sort of up the rungs in whatever career path or school path you take. All right. Another question from chat. I saw that Oxy has some computational neuroscience classes. What are these like? Are they more focused on learning the theory or experimenting? So, great question. I have not taught or really been present in either of them. Those are COGS for 242 and 243. I think both of them have labs. One is much more math based. Reese, have you taken either of these? Okay. What have you heard? Yeah. Yeah, I think the one that Professor Nelly's doing this semester is a little bit more like theory and then putting into practice with like EEG research. Um, because that's her research domain. The other one by Professor Kinnair is definitely more math based. I'm almost certain that they use MATLAB a lot in that class. And I have seen some of the handouts that he's used to talk about like the mathematics in there. It's so I would say both definitely lean more towards theory, but if you want to get into computational neuroscience in general, I would say both courses are absolutely essential because they give you the tools that you'll need to use in order to figure out how to basically model things that would be adjacent to like AI or deep learning or other things like that that are honestly a little bit outside my own wheelhouse. Um, but if you want to figure out some more answers to your questions there, I would definitely contact Professor Nelly in the Cog Sci department, um, Professor Knair, that's Knoerr, is the one who does the more mathematically oriented course. And then the other cog sci folk as well, like Professors Leviton and Sherman, can give some other answers. But the first two will probably give you a little bit more directed answers about the particular courses. Next question from chat. Why did you decide to become a professor and not do something else in the psychology/cog sci field? Another good question. Initially, I guess we could rewind this back to when I was beginning my undergrad. I was like, I'm going to do research. So I was set on research. At that time, I had kind of been bouncing around between STEM fields, trying to figure out what one fit me best. Tried physics at first. Those courses were kind of brutal for me at the time. For reference, I had somehow gotten into honors physics as a starting freshman, thought I was failing the course, got out of it with a B, and then I said, I'm lucky here. I'm just going to try to pivot to something else that works a little bit more with what I can do. But the route I ended up going was psychology initially. All my degrees are in psychology. And I still knew that I wanted to do research. I initially thought I wanted to do like neuropharmacology stuff. So that's like how drugs and chemistry work in the brain. And that is what I ended up doing in graduate school. So I did have like a mind for pursuing research and exploring questions that hadn't really been explored before. Now, that's not teaching per se. Like, this is not like a research institution. Things like the University of California system, those are research institutions. Stanford, the UC, no, USC, confusing all my U's. All those schools are like big research institutions where teaching is there, but I would say it's not as priority. Here, teaching is much more priority. Getting students involved with research is much more priority, and we only have undergraduates rather than graduate students. So it might beg the question, why did I pivot to more of a teaching focus? And that's probably because when I was doing my research in Michigan before I came here, I kind of felt like I looked at other labs and I saw this revolving door of student labor where they would just kind of come in, do the things in the day that they were assigned, and then just check out. Like, there was no intellectual inquiry. It's not to say that that didn't happen in the lab I was in. There was a lot happening in the lab I was in at the time. A lot of people doing a lot of different things. But the folks in other labs that would have undergraduate students working with them wouldn't really try to like get them to focus on the conceptual ideas behind the project or the bigger picture things. And so I got more interested in like teaching students about methodology, about concepts behind neuroscience, and that's what gravitated me toward a teaching position as a professor. I think that a lot of my ideas lined up with being a professor. I did briefly entertain the idea of going into industry before, and so what an industry job would look like. And I know that Reese, you kind of asked a question along this line, if I'm called briefly perusing it. It was slightly different, but we can kind of wrap back to that in a bit. But as far as like career options that are neuroscience related, usually it's working for a biotech company, pharmaceutical company. There are a lot of startups. Some of them exist in LA. And so there are a decent amount of options out there. But I think it was the fact that I wanted to research my own thing. I didn't want to have to be like a product at the end. Like, you can research a lot more freely within academia, especially when you don't have to like do it for a project manager or some sort of funding goal or things like that. So I think having the research control was a lot more in my interest, and then also involving other people in like the learning process in general is kind of how I ended up here compared to a lot of other options. Next question up is, do most neuroscientists have to get some degree in psych? It seems like they cross over a lot. There are separate neuroscience degrees, so you can get a PhD in neuroscience. There are programs that are specifically for that. The crossover with psych happens because a lot of psych programs have a bio division. My program for graduate school was exactly that. And also when I was an undergrad, I did a flipperoo because initially I mentioned I was physics, and then I tried like biochemistry, and then I was like, this is too small scale for me. And at the suggestion of an advisor that I had at the time, uh, she suggested cell biology and neuroscience. And I was going for that. But then at my school, there are only in that program two neuroscience courses. The rest is all cell bio and medical related stuff. So that didn't quite cater to me. And I was taking a psychology minor. So I just flipped them around where I did biology minor and then a psychology major. And I had a lot of bio and chem courses under my belt that a lot of other psych majors didn't have at the time. So it's one of those turning lemons into lemonade thing, I guess. Um, but that's kind of the background about how I got to being in a psych major. And then I stuck with it because, again, there was a decent biology contingent that still wanted to learn about the brain and how it affects the mind. Um, there is a little bit more flexibility nowadays where you can get unorthodox degrees in neuroscience. So, what I mean by that is when you go to a neuroscience conference, you might see people with degrees in engineering because they're working on like robotics and interface with the human body and mind. You might get people that are very chemistry heavy because they're trying to figure out how do I make electrodes that can stay long term in the brain or something like that. Um, you can get people in philosophy because they're interested in like mental computation things and ethics. Let's say ethics is a much a growing field because of the influences of AI and how we do research nowadays and other things of that nature. So, even though psychology does make up a large contingent of people that work in the neuroscience field, I do think that it's pivoting now to not just be psychology, that you have people that are in all these different domains that can fall under a much wider umbrella of what's in neuroscience. Um, what is the benefit for you of postdoctoral research? So, for people that are unclear about the pathway that I took, I did my undergrad, got a psych degree. I went to graduate school to get a PhD. You can get a master's, and that is considered like, I'm not trying to punch down when I say this, but master's is considered a lesser degree because you have to spend less time on a particular project and there's a lot less that goes into it. The trade-off is that when you finish a master's degree in like a year or two, you're done and you're out in the field. PhD, the average is like 5.5 years, and I hit that average right on the head. Other people have been in their PhD program for like 7+ years. Yeah, their advisor in those cases did not push them out fast enough. I've seen cases where the advisor holds on to them so they can keep getting more research out of the grad student. Again, not all advisors are good. They don't advise properly. Everybody's human. They make mistakes. They have ulterior motives, right? By the way, that person that I have in mind, after they finished their grad degree at like 7+ years, he then went on to physician's assistant school. And then I was like, but wait, you why did you do all that? I know it was kind of wild. Whatever. People gravitate to whatever works for them, but that's a lot of time to sink in. So after you do graduate school, typically you do the PhD first before you do something postdoctoral, because what a PhD is, philosophical doctorate degree. So PH for philosophical, D for doctorate. And It's like a research and knowledge kind of degree. It's not to say that master's degree doesn't present knowledge. It's just that with a PhD, having that degree on your record, it means that you can be an independent thinker and researcher and figure out solutions to problems on your own rather than being an advanced technical worker like master's degrees usually do. And so, even though I had a PhD, what is expected in the neuroscience field is that you do a postdoctoral research stint for it varies in the amount of time. Some people might be able to do it for just 2 to 3 years. Other people might do postdocs like back to back, where it goes to like 6 years, and that's where uh, you're still an independent researcher in mind, but you're utilizing somebody's lab space in order to do this research. So you do advanced research under the tutelage of somebody who is a very established faculty member. In my case, I did it under this guy named Kent Berridge over at University of Michigan. And that was so I could get more research experience outside of the skills I already had. And those would help me become more independent after that. So you're kind of building more skill sets. It's part of the reason why they call it a postdoctoral fellowship, or I like to call it like an advanced apprenticeship, is one way to think of it, to build more skills so that when you're actually going to apply for these jobs, you're going to be able to have all sorts of skills at your disposal and be able to figure out all sorts of different problems. And so if anybody asked me these random questions that seem like they would kind of outside my domain, then I have the answers for it. That's kind of a little bit of why, because my research interests have been really all over the place. Um, but yeah, I think that answers your question. Zoom is really being sluggish today. Let me go ahead and scroll down a little bit. All right. Yeah. Most cog sci classes we've looked at in this class have been lab studies, but I was wondering if neuroscientists, PhDs have to have psych knowledge if they want to go somewhere else in the world and do studies in the field. I would say you'll have people that are in the neuroscience domain that will actually be not savvy in psychology stuff. An example I have is I knew somebody who was a neuroscience professor uh, who taught psychology courses but did not know what the DSM is. And we covered the DSM very briefly in class, but recall that is the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Disorders, what clinicians use to diagnose mental disorders. It seemed weird to me at the time that somebody that was within a psychology department, even if their origins were in neuroscience, it seemed weird to me that they wouldn't know what the DSM is. And that's not a knock to them. It just shows you how much diversity there is in this field, that it's not just only psychology or only cell neuroscientists or people that only work with proteins in cells, that you can actually get a lot of variability. Even if our cog sci classes focus on the psychological bend, that's more because of my own background and what my true comfort zone and interest is. I don't go into the computational stuff, as I kind of implied earlier. And then there are other things in neuroscience that I also just kind of touch on, but I don't lean into that much. Follow up to that was, uh, if there's somewhere in the world where a group of people take a very specific drug that is only taken by people in that area, will someone have to go there and get basic knowledge on it from just observing, or they take it immediately into the lab? I would say that if we're talking about like, let's say we're talking about something like traditional medicine, we're trying to figure out if there's a drug that has anti-cancer properties or anti-Parkinson's properties, if we're going to make it more relevant to our class, then we may do something where, and this is, there are some ethical issues with this potentially, but we may take samples from that area of that herb and try to isolate chemicals and then research them in various Parkinson's model situations. Those could lead to the development of drugs that are similar to those chemicals synthesized in lab that can be then used for that purpose. Now, I said that there's ethical issues with that. And the thing is that whenever white people show up and try to go into some sort of land that was preserved for centuries before that and had certain traditions to take care of the land and make sure we didn't deplete certain essential ingredients to medicines over there. The problem is that there isn't much mindfulness as far as making sure that we have minimal impact on what happens there. So I think about how like various countries will investigate medicines elsewhere, but then they'll just sort of set up camp and then start establishing like a base camp there that turns into a facility and things like that. And it gets very messy with what happens to the local populace, the plant life, the animal species. Like there ends up being long-term impacts, like it's an occupation basically. And that's what I have concerns about when it comes to trying to go somewhere and then putting some sort of research installation there, that it has to be done in a very mindful way. I know this is extremely tangential to what you're asking, but that's exactly what this session is for today. Okay. People can continue to plop things into Zoom chat. I am going to go ahead and take a quick look at Moodle as well. So we got first comment up here. Given that you completed your BA in psychology, I was interested in learning about what inspired you to go into the neuroscience domain afterwards. As a psychology major myself, I was also curious if you participated in any particular summer research programs, longer internships during or post undergrad, and how that was helpful for you for your academic career later on. It seems like as the years have gone, is there an increased pressure and demand to be involved and build your resume? Did you have a similar experience? So an important point to that, an important response to that last point, uh, if someone tells you you can just do what I've done in the past, uh, like a faculty advisor or something says, just follow what I've done, follow my game plan. No, no, because chances are that if it's even been like 5 years, things have still changed since then. I don't want to make it sound like everything's gotten increasingly competitive because there's going to be a ceiling point at which nobody's going to be able to attain certain high levels except for too small of a fraction of folks. But I do think things are more competitive. So even though I would have advice about what I did, I need to kind of keep track of what I hear from students that are actively applying. Like I write recommendation letters that tell me how their time has gone trying to do various things, establish themselves in graduate programs or after undergrad work. And it's still pretty competitive. So I think it's good to ask as early as possible, like how to navigate that. Like if you have specific plans, then usually a faculty advisor can give you ideas about maybe how to navigate that, as long as they're not doing the thing of, oh, if you just do what I did, that's not really taking into account that stuff changes. And I've had a few advisors or like a few people that I've talked to that are like partially advising me that have tried to give me that advice of like, it'll be okay if you do this and this. Not necessarily. Like you have to figure out what works now rather than worked back then. Um, Other parts of that question though. So I think with the psychology to neuroscience transition for me, it was because I was interested in pharmacologic research in the brain. And so that was always an interest of mine. So drugs and human behavior or how certain neurochemistry works to do certain things. But yeah, the pivot really happened in undergrad, I want to say, when I did a maybe semester and a half long thing. I was working with mice that lacked specific opioid receptors. So we talked about opioids in the drug segment, and mice can be genetically altered to lack some of those receptors. These mice were viable, they would grow into adulthood, but they would have specific problems with like having abnormal digestion or abnormal behaviors. And so one thing I was doing was testing this thing called marble burying in mice, which might sound weird, but mice don't like shiny metal things in their enclosure. If they're anxious, they will spend more time burying them than if they're not anxious. And so that is like a funny little psychology test that I was doing in addition to some other things in that lab. Now, I should have participated in more stuff after that. It would have been ideal, but unfortunately, I just didn't get into it. And I had a year off between undergrad and grad school. So while I was kind of prepping my applications, I did some side work that was unrelated just to make money so I could live independently. But I also worked part time for my parents' business where they machine custom parts from microscope equipment. So I built up skills with how to fabricate stuff, whether it's metal or different types of metal, how to position it in 3D space. So I kind of learned a little bit of engineering stuff that I ended up using in my lab to make custom parts that I would use for experiments later on. And so that's a little bit about how I kind of found myself and gravitated toward the particular lab I ended up working in. Let's see, another question, adding on to the previous. What have you found in psychology and neuroscience intersecting in my work? When might you see it? And are there any recent studies that have focused on the two subjects? I would say that most of my work in both graduate school and postdoctoral stuff was what we would call behavioral neuroscience. And that really requires an intersection of both of the fields. It's not the only way that they can intersect, but when we're doing behavioral neuroscience, we want to figure out, okay, what brain circuits lead to what behaviors? It's kind of like with the disgust experiment, where we're manipulating chemicals in the brain, and then we see that, oh, it causes this extreme disgust that lasts short term to various stimuli. So that would be a very salient example of that for this class. But other people do other experiments, like trying to track with how certain psychological processes occur while there's brain activity going on. We've seen this a bit when we look at MRI experiments, or especially here at Oxy, some faculty do experiments where they have people do tasks on a computer, but they're also having their brain read via EEG scans. And so those are two key areas, or two domains in which the two fields intersect a lot. And so you'll have a lot of psychologists and a lot of neuroscience, not neuroscientists, both overlapping and doing things within those fields. You can have things that are totally separate, though. I've known people that worked in cellular neuroscience, and they work in like water channels in cells, for instance, and that's super cellular and super divorced from psychology. So it's a bit different in that case, but it shows you how, again, the field can be pretty diverse. Another question from Moodle. What are some of the most common research topics in the neuroscience field? Are there any new topics that seem to be more cutting edge or impactful on the field of neuroscience? So, this one, I feel like there are so many topics within neuroscience that it kind of can cover a lot of different domains. Um, so, hmm, I think that what ends up happening is that diseases end up being researched the most. So we think like Alzheimer's disease, that's had tons of money and tons of effort poured into it. Parkinson's for sure. Aging in general, aging of the brain, that's got a lot of research being poured into it. So a lot of things that have like medical incentives and thus pharmaceutical company funding going into them, those will be more commonly researched. Other things like sensory research has received a lot of attention, whether it's for just understanding how the senses work, to figuring out how we could create implants to replace lost organs, like replace eyes with cybernetic implants or things like that. We're not too far off from being able to do that at this point because of all the research that's been done. Um, Topics that are more cutting edge or impactful in the neuroscience field. I feel like one of the ones that's up and coming is gut microbiome and how it influences the brain, but it is very messy because there are so many different possible factors in that camp. Like there isn't just a few different bacteria that people research. There's all these extremely complex interactions that we're barely scratching the surface of. So if you're going to go into a field that's particularly an unknown or wild west, it's going to be gut microbiome and how it influences the brain from a neurochemical perspective, because there are just so many possible targets and so many possible interactions to take into account. Other than that, cutting edge. I think that a lot of things that involve implants into people's brains to try to replace limbs, organs, etc., that's still pretty up and coming. Like we're getting really close to basically just replacing a lot of that stuff. So it's soon to happen. The other thing that I know is up and coming is genetic manipulation. We'll have to see how that ethically is maintained in neuroscience, because you can imagine eugenics being a concern with that. And then one other thing would be AI and neuroscience. Maybe not to research AI per se, but to use AI as a means to expedite how data is analyzed when there's a ton of it, such as mapping the human brain. Uh, let's see, got another one from Zoom. What is a condition or disease that you think should be studied more, and why do you think that it has not received the proper backing that you think it deserves? Hmm, I feel like the diseases that are most impactful to society are getting the attention that they should. Sometimes the attention is a little bit misguided. Like, for instance, Alzheimer's has looked at like plaques and tangles in the brain, which we will be covering next week a little bit. But those that wasn't really the core cause. So I think the problem that happens with a lot of diseases is that there'll be a focus on researching the disease, but it'll be researching the wrong cause. And that'll be tricky because how do you know what the right cause of the disease is? Well, you do by more research and finding out that the thing that we've been pursuing and have run through clinical trials doesn't actually work for people and that it has to be something else. As for like a particular disease that doesn't get the attention overall, I don't know that I have one in mind. I feel like I feel like things that might need more research are just ones that people know less about. Fatal familial insomnia is one that we covered, which is like kind of scary. Uh, not kind, it is scary. If you have it, it's scary. Um, so that one I think needs to receive more research. Another one that actually is like more concerning than fatal familial insomnia is a contagious thing called prion diseases. And this is sort of like a clue for a question I'll be asking next week. Prions are just proteins that have gone rogue, they're misshapen, and misshapen proteins do a different thing than proteins that are the correct shape. It can be made of all the same amino acids or just have one little change, but then the protein being shaped a different way causes it to have a different function. And sometimes that function is extremely damaging to the brain. This is actually what happens in both Huntington's and fatal familial insomnia. Is how protein garbage builds up in that these proteins are made wrong and then they just cause problems. But there's another thing that happens where other diseases involve a protein that's found naturally that gets in and infects the brain like a virus. The problem is it doesn't work like a virus or a bacteria or anything else. It's really hard for your body to target a misfolded protein and prevent it from going on to other proteins and then making them misshapen too. You could think of it like zombies, where if there are zombies, they'll convert people into more zombies. So I like to call prions, spelled Prion, prion diseases, like zombie protein diseases, and they'll cause a lot of problems. If people want to look this one up, there's like mad cow disease, or the technical name for it is Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which I am not going to spell for you because I have not much confidence in spelling it myself. Um, that one is a prion disease, and that's scary, and why people are super leery about like the mad cow disease if it's detected in like livestock. Pivoting back to some Moodle stuff, and also Reese, if you have anything that you want to chime in on, feel free, but also don't feel pressured. Yeah, just putting it out there because I just kind of talking. So, all right. Um, Ethics of experiments. That's a fair thing to start off on. Yeah. Used to come to important conclusions in the neuroscience slash cognitive science field. Seems unethical to perform procedures that make rats or mice gain a lot of weight or become completely antisocial. Obviously, it would be unethical to perform these on humans, but animals cannot consent. So, would these researchers be violating the code of ethics? How is the research like this justified? So, there is a double standard here. That is something I want to admit completely forwardly. With people, we have things like informed consent, and various other things like debriefings about the experiment, what it's being used for, all sorts of safeguards, no harm, minimize deception when it comes to people. Like, you only do deception if it's absolutely essential for your psychology experiment to work. With rodent research, and animal research in general, there are different rules. And that is partly because at its origins, animal research was based on the idea that animals do not have like a mind or consciousness. Now, as we've kind of hinted out in this class, and as some of you who are taking or have taken mind, brain, and behavior, we kind of have a different perspective on that nowadays, where animals do have consciousness. Is a question of what is happening in their mind. I don't think that they have concepts of like complex concepts of thinking about like days or populations or politics or anything like that. But it does make me a lot more leery about doing animal research in general. Now, we do have to draw differences between, let's say, a fly versus a rat. A rat is going to have a more complex life experience, even if that experience is in a lab environment, compared to a fly, where they're going to have just enough brain power to figure out how to navigate in 3D space with flight, how to figure out the motor related stuff for flight, some rudimentary social behaviors that involve just brief interactions, and that's kind of it. They're not really good for long-term planning, let's say. You can't train a fly to lever press, for instance. Um, but kind of getting back to your point about ethics, because that's its origin, that's part of the reason why we do a lot more invasive things. Uh, the ethics field is changing. It has been changing even since I had started as a undergrad, grad student, and then postdoc. It had become much more restrictive as far as what kind of harm is allowed to even rodent models. And I think that part of that is because we want to do minimal harm, but we have to figure out, if we're researching an alternative to opiates, we have to induce pain in the organism to figure out how do we blunt that pain with some sort of intervention. So if we can't do that research, then we can't come up with life-saving medications and other things of that nature. Uh, the other tricky thing is sometimes it's not even about like pain blunting. Sometimes it's about how we need things to actually treat people immediately. Think of the COVID situation. In order to figure out what works, we had to make animals that were genetically manipulated to be infected with COVID. So rats and mice, they don't get COVID. Lucky them. They're lucky in a lot of other ways that we find out treatments for various diseases. But we had to manipulate their genes so that they could be infected with COVID, so we could figure out ways to treat them and resolve the COVID infection. A lot of other animals are used that have comparable immune systems to humans to try to figure out how immune therapies work in order to save lives. So it's not that we're just doing research to explore the brain and just learn stuff. Some of this is medically oriented, and people have weighed the cost of human life being saved versus animal life being preserved. And there is sort of a lot of debate about like how far do you want to go. I know I lean much more on the preserving human lives over animal lives to a certain degree, but that's only if the animal lives are being used to effectively better human society without ruining the environment or making an animal extinct or causing undue harm, suffering, etc. So I definitely have my boundaries on what I consider acceptable. And I know that at various schools, the leash on animal research is being tightened slowly as far as what's allowed to be done and what will be vetoed by various ethics committees. Going to go back to Moodle for a bit. How does the role of a neuroscientist differ in a government or nonprofit organization versus those working in private institutions? The way I like to look at it is that there are three different research positions you could be in after you get like a graduate degree or something like that. You could go into a biotech company. And so that would involve just kind of researching toward a product. You'd be part of a group. And sometimes if products don't work, you just move to a different product. I do hear that there is a little instability with the job. where you should be prepared to change companies every once in a while, but it's easier once you get into a company to get jobs at other similar types of companies or doing similar types of work. The way that those jobs work is that usually you're trying to work your way up the ladder, going from doing the research hands on to managing the projects of research to managing the managers of projects and so on and so forth. So there is like a ladder that people climb. I'm less interested in that ladder because the idea of those higher up administrative roles honestly bores me to tears. Like oh, I couldn't imagine doing that as my daily. I need to kind of be in the lab like at least every once in a while to actually feel like I'm alive. Not in general, but like compared to other job prospects. Yeah. So that's like one thing that happens when you work for some of these biotech and pharmaceuticals. And although I'm painting like a negative picture, you get paid really well usually, like way better than you do as a professor. So that's typically the trade off. And usually your job will end within the 9 to 5 or so period. They're not going to hassle you at like weird hours over the weekend unless there's something that's time sensitive the company does. But usually people are a little bit more allowed to draw boundaries at the workday and not beyond that. For public or nonprofit institutions, we can kind of split those into two categories ish. What comes to mind is government institutions like National Institute of Health has a bunch of different divisions. We've got one for drug abuse, that's NIDA, National Institute for Drug Abuse, and that they do research there. There's National Institute for Mental Health. They fund a lot of biological brain research things. So they do have their own research facilities, though, specifically in Bethesda, Maryland. And those are competitive to get into. I don't know that people stay in there long term unless they're like on one of the higher rungs of the institution. But people will usually do pretty solid research that is a little bit similar to what you'd find at one of these bigger universities. But again, you just kind of have like more of an established role there. And then you got the colleges and universities in which you're expected to at least teach to some degree while also doing research, but then also doing things that are part of keeping the school afloat, like being on various committees that the school has that students don't really hear about but are behind the scenes, um, and various machinations of just making the college work. An example of one of those committees is Oxy has one here called the Academic Programming Committee, APC, and they determine things like the hiring of certain professors, the change of curriculums, all these other things. So students don't usually hear about things that are like under the hood, so to speak. And that's one of many committees that does stuff like that. Students might be part of certain groups that coordinate with a faculty committee, so you may be more aware of such committees. So that's kind of my distinction between some of those different ways that you would kind of do neuroscience in those different career paths. Another one from Moodle: how would one become a researcher within the neuroscience/cognoscience field? Are there specific milestones? And what resources from school or outside could we use to achieve this goal or experience what the setting may be like? My recommendations for starters is that if you are in a school, you should try to at least shadow someone's research project, if not get involved in the lab research yourself. Now, I say this with the caveat that I myself need to take some time off from like mentoring new students. So I'm not sure that I'll be able to take students in the coming spring and summer. I'm going to need like time to kind of recoup all this stuff that has been sitting on the back burner for a while. That said, though, I do recommend you reach out to specific faculty that you've read the research bios of. You can look on the Oxy website on their particular faculty pages to figure out what they do, what they research, or at least their contact information if they talk about interesting things in your classes. I think one thing that students don't realize is that you don't have to be restricted to just the professors here at Oxy. You can go outside. It's a little trickier, but it's okay to email professors at other institutions saying, hey, look, I'm really interested in your research over there. We don't have anything like that here, and I'd like to work with you, or I'd like to volunteer, or something like that. Now, these positions are usually volunteer based, at least at the start. Um, Compensation can be had. Usually, it's easier to get course credit for doing research compared to getting just straight up money or salary for it. But after undergrad, you can get research technician positions. Those are rather competitive, but having some research experience as a volunteer as an undergrad usually helps a lot with that. So, as far as becoming a researcher, uh, getting involved with things at school is definitely a first major step, and having a rapport with faculty as far as like what the research is sort of like an in to doing that. I do think things are changing though, where we're trying to involve research opportunities for high schoolers. Obviously that can be a bit tricky because there's the lack of knowledge base and prior experience, but we also want to make sure that it's equitable and reachable for everybody. And having it locked behind college tuition isn't exactly what I call fair. So, uh, having research more accessible to people that are not going to college immediately or are not in college, I think is kind of an important thing as far as how we can evolve the field. As far as other resources, there are a lot of resources. Oh God, sorry, I popped another thing up on the window. Uh, it was Cortana again. She wanted to say hi. God, why am I so bad with the tech in this room? All right, resources. There are a lot of different online resources that you could get into. I think one of them, the acronym is FUN. So it's a little bit of a cheesy acronym given what it is. It is Foundation for Undergraduate Neuroscience. And so that might give you ideas of avenues of research you could pursue or get into, or people you could contact. And so again, that's FUN, FUN, Foundation for Undergraduate Neuroscience. There are also larger societies that you could try to get involved with. For instance, there's a Society for Neuroscience. I go to their conference when it rotates back to San Diego once every 3 years, because flying is expensive otherwise. And that one is a really big and resource filled conference, but they have a lot of things online that you could probably access without having to be a member per se. Maybe give you some ideas about what avenues you could pursue or people you could talk to. Ah, yes. So, career neuroscience, look without a graduate degree. Is a graduate degree necessary, per your question? So, um, I think that certain jobs you do need the degree for, but that's kind of like having any prior experience or any other degree. Like, for instance, you're not going to be a medical doctor if you don't have an MD. That's pretty clear to us. Um, it's a little hazier, I know, when it comes to the different graduate degrees. So I prefaced before with saying that there's masters and there's PhD. Those can get you different kinds of jobs. The way I look at the degrees is that coming out of bachelor's, you can usually get a paid research technician position. And if you have prior research experience here at school, let's say, or even if you took a year off and just continue to work at a research lab as a volunteer, then you'll usually be able to get a paid research technician position. You might be like the lab manager or something. You might get to that point, but those paid positions do exist. You do need that prior experience, otherwise you will not be a competitive applicant. You do also need to show that you have strong interest in that research in that lab. Otherwise, they're not going to want to take you. Like you have to be committed to doing the lab work, um, like a job, rather than like a show up as a volunteer kind of thing. So after you have that experience, it might be able to get you into a company rather than having a graduate degree. So the graduate degree can be a substitute for X years of experience. It is a little wonky the way that works sometimes because they'll be like, oh, yeah, 1 year in this graduate program or 2 years of experience in the field. So in that kind of job. So that's sometimes how they translate it. I do think it's an insane thing to say, oh, yeah, you need 10 years of experience in the field or a graduate degree that you were in 5 years. That seems like too big of a difference to me. So I feel like drawing that boundary is a little fluky. But also, HR departments write these job postings, and they usually set the bar really high, expecting fewer people to actually reach that bar. So I do think that if you have interest in something and you feel like half of the requirements, you should still apply to stuff. I think it's still worth it. They write those things in order to almost deter too many people from applying because they want to sift through all the applications. Even if one day they have AI do it, and thus AI will have a chance to screw it all up compared to a person actually doing it, because HR is a black hole of no return. Yeah, all those things kind of are things to consider when you're trying to apply for these positions. Now, you might be wondering, what does a master's degree get you? It can get you a much more advanced research technician position. Like you can definitely go from master's degree into easily like lab manager at an institute, and you could do that for a while before you do something else. Um, I kind of see the degrees in what they get you as this. Bachelor's can get you the idea of the core concepts and maybe a little bit of how to get started in the field. Master's degree is you can be a skilled technician. You know how to do things. You have the skills. And then PhD degree is you know how to design research projects to answer research questions. So the PhD is much more like project manager or overseer kind of roles. And those are the jobs that people with PhDs normally aim for. Some of those jobs might require a postdoc, but not all of them do. Like I could have gone straight into industry after graduate degree finished up. And for a basis of comparison, because of job stuff being brought up, a colleague that I did my postdoc with, he was also another postdoctoral fellow working around the same time that I did. When he wrapped up, he actually got burned out on research. He's like, I am so done with the way that research works in higher education. I want to do something else. So he got a position as a medical science liaison where he works with labs in order to figure out what drugs are the best for research projects or what other chemicals are best for research projects and things of that nature. So there are a lot of pivots people can take, even if they've been on a particular path for a long time. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, so I would say that you can get jobs without a graduate degree. If they're research based, they still require you to have that background skill. But I think that's true of any job, that they'll require you to have, like, dare I say, a 3 to 5 years prior experience for entry level job. It's a little absurd, and I don't think that that bar is realistically actually that high. They're just using it as a deterrent to keep people from applying en masse, let's say. All right. Last thing that I have on Moodle. Are there any emerging new topics in neuroscience or psychology that you're currently wanting to study? If so, what steps would have to be taken to start a new experiment or trial? One thing that I was interested in that I can't really do right now is there are some people that research zebrafish here in the bio department, and they look at it more for like the cellular aspects of it. I would be interested in trying to see if I could take the rat research I did with Disgust and trying to apply it in zebrafish models. Partly because you can manipulate the genes a lot better. You don't necessarily have to do surgery on zebrafish. I did a lot of rat brain surgeries, and those were not only mentally and physically taxing, but at a certain point, a little bit emotionally taxing after many years. So doing zebrafish seemed like an interesting pivot, but I definitely don't have the resources or the time to like do that pivot right now. So in the meantime, I'm just looking at brain tissue that came from rat experiments. Those experiments were done, let's say, at UCSD, where they had rats under the influence of cocaine, and we're trying to see how brain markers of addiction change in the brain. I think I mentioned way back when we talk about methods, the idea of CFOS and how there's this other thing called delta FOSB. That's a thing that I've been doing fluorescent staining of the brain for. And I'm also interested in that other technique, clarity or similar things that we had for reading quite a while ago. So those would be things that are a little bit more accessible and approachable. It's just a question of having the time. don't exactly have all the time in the world. So I hope for getting that time, maybe in the spring, hopefully the summer, but in the coming years as I try to balance my workload with other duties that I have here at Oxy. All right. So I think that covers the Moodle stuff. Um, if people have anything else on Zoom, please add it now, because I'm otherwise going to wrap up the class shortly. I'll end on maybe some concluding thoughts. Whenever you are looking at any field, it doesn't even have to be neuroscience. I really recommend that you get hands-on with it to figure out, is it right for you? And just because you have a certain lab experience that doesn't go well doesn't mean you should write off the field as a whole. I've seen people do this a lot where they will have a bad lab experience because the advisor is just terrible, but it isn't the research that was the problem for them. It was just the way that the lab was run. And that is unfortunate, but that's how it goes sometimes. As far as who you work under, it can make a huge difference. I've had some very kind patient advisors that aren't, again, helicoptering over me. But then I've seen other advisors that are kind of, they're expecting you to be in the lab like 12 hours a day, every day, sometimes on weekends. And it's like, okay, that's maybe a bit much. I believe in work-life balance. I know that some experiments are very time sensitive where you have to go in at a weird hour. But that can't be all the time. It's not sustainable. And so I think you should avoid advisors that expect an absurd workload out of you, and advisors that are not patient or understanding whenever life just doesn't go your way. If you have advisors like that, they're expecting you to feed into a very toxic work culture that exists in the research disciplines. And I think that we need to pivot away from that. The sort of properties of that culture are that it's hyper competitive, breeds a personality that works with a hyper competitive environment that is uncaring, unsympathetic. And then it just creates a research field that overlooks certain things that are more humanistic as well. I know that things are changing now. It was much worse once upon a time, if you can believe that, despite things feeling more competitive than they were previously. I do think that instilling some sense of diversity in a lot of different ways into the field has helped reverse some of the problems. Not all of them. We do need to fix the culture of research, but I'm just asking you all to be aware that whoever you volunteer with or work under, you be very aware of what their expectations are for your work, and that if they seem like they're expecting a lot, that you get a second opinion from somebody to see that, oh, is this weird? Are they asking too much of me? Are they asking for things that are outside of what my work contract asks for? And are they threatening to get rid of me if I don't do these other duties that aren't even part of my job description? That's kind of red flags for toxic work environment. And those are things I've seen in the research field. And I've tried to mentor people in trying to get away from toxic labs, or to at least avoid toxic labs. And so if people are applying to work under certain people, it's okay to ask other faculty at other schools, hey, do you know this person? Are they a good person to work with? Because a lot of people I won't know. But if there are some people, like let's say at institutions I've been at, that I know the names of, I know how they run their labs, I'll be able to say, they're okay. They have these issues, but like as long as you go in knowing this is how it works, you'll be fine. Or there are some other people where I'll be like, don't work with that person. Period. Just stop there. Because otherwise I'll just kind of like start actually like defaming them, and I don't need to do that. I just need to tell you, don't work with them. Anyway, I hope that this session has been like really informative as far as how to navigate the field for those who are interested in it, or for those who are just curious about like how, for instance, I got to be where I am, how the other professors got to be here where they are. And again, if you didn't manage to ask questions today or on Moodle, do keep in mind that we do have the opportunity for you to post to the same Moodle thread for any follow-up questions that I could kind of either address in an email or a Google Doc in the coming week. With that said, we're going to wrap up a little early, and I will catch y'all next week when we all get back from a hopefully restful break. Take care, y'all.
Hello there. So this is just me continuing the Ask Me Anything segment based on some of the comments that you guys had left on the Moodle page after the session that we had pre-Thanksgiving. So I just wanted to comment on some of those since, I didn't want to leave those hanging out at the end there. So let me just go ahead and review some of the questions that you guys posted. In particular, I also wanted to call attention to the fact that one of you, Eloise, had put together a useful list of sort of short notes on what I had discussed during the class time on that Tuesday. So if people want to get a quick summary of that, you can look to the Moodle forum page for that as well. I noticed that you had brought up how there are a lot of big ticket research topics like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Do you feel that there are any critical areas of neurological or cognitive study that are underfunded or under-researched currently? I think I touched on this a little bit at the end of the session last time, but I do want to sort of give a shout out to basically things having to do with microglia and brain inflammation, some of the nuances there, immune system effects on the brain, autism spectrum disorder, whether it's a disorder or not. These are areas that I think are not well researched currently. There's also some research on gender and identity, but I know that that's, at least from the research I've seen, it's pretty well in its infancy because it's really hard to pin down specific brain areas or even specific networks that really contain an identity that's not just super individualized. What skill do you feel like has been the most useful one to have in your career, and what is a skill that you were surprised to find helpful that most people majoring in cognitive science might not have? How do you think the future of cognitive science and neuroscience will change career option-wise? I think that I can kind of answer these a little bit backwards. As far as career stuff, I imagine that research options will kind of hold steady. I don't really see that declining in the coming years. I think that there might be more therapy-related interventions having to do with both cognition and neuroscience. So yeah, I think that probably therapeutic stuff is where you'll get an expansion of career options. Although I do wonder about like AI and the intervention of how that's going to affect therapy and, again, career options. What skill do you feel like has been the most useful one? I think that it's hard for me to pin down a particular skill. I think if you are good in persuasive writing, that goes pretty far. I also think that if you have good presentation skills, that's also kind of a very good thing to have. There is a sort of wild card one I developed. So my parents have had a, how do I term it? They basically make custom parts for microscopes and related equipment. I had done some machining work. So basically metal lathes, drill presses, things of that nature, where you can rework metal parts into specific shapes in order to have them screw together, fit together, and again, make custom parts. And I think that actually did pretty well for me as far as my neuroscience background and research. I was able to make custom parts for my experiments. Skill that I was surprised that would be helpful would probably be that machining type one, because it's not something that you would really find in the field too often. Usually you don't find people with engineering backgrounds of any sort in fields like cognitive science, I want to say. How would you recommend connecting with people you believe would be good mentors and creating a relationship with them? I think that a lot of students, what they do is that they end up talking with their professors. So I don't think that's a bad idea. It's definitely like the go-to route. You should also be forward in talking with your professors. I know that a lot of students are very timid, and that's fine. But it is important to show initiative in having conversations with people, even if you're not sure exactly what the conversations might be about. If you're just unsure about a lot of things, it's okay to kind of start up those conversations with people that could be potential mentors. And just because you contact somebody at first doesn't mean you have to stick with them as a mentor. The only exception would be, of course, like if you're doing research and there's a project that's ongoing, you'd want to at least hand things off before you dip out. Or if you're there like and funded as somebody who's supposed to be there for like X amount of years, there are particulars about trying to continue that research as well. But as far as finding mentors, you can find things that you're interested in, see if there are faculty at the school that you would be able to talk more about that with. And if not, I think that students should also feel free reaching outside of the school if they feel like there's a niche somewhere else. I think that a lot of students feel a little bit insulated at Occidental, and that there are options as far as who can be a mentor outside of that as well. Has there been a time where you have been in conflict with another neuroscientist? And if so, how did you go about resolving it? I would say that the times I've been in conflict with people have just been like weird interpersonal things, misunderstandings. It mostly happened like in my training years, where I would want to do something a certain way, somebody else would disagree with it. We weren't even working on the same project though, so I don't think it was quite butting heads like people might expect. However, if it was like using the same lab resources, like for our respective experiments, people get very, very possessive if it's something that can affect the future of their experiment. So I think that it's really important to have like a level-headed discussion about why we think certain approaches are okay to do with certain resources, see if we're wrong about our positions, and just try to go from it from a non-stressful perspective. Because I think that the catalyst in those cases for me, for the conflict, was with the stresses that were going on in lab, in personal life, and other such things. How has your understanding of neuroscience changed the ways in which you engage with the world, or specific topics like politics, philosophy, media, etc.? And as a side question, do you think neuroscience is something everyone should study at some point because of the ways it has you think about the world? Or is it some more of a niche topic that should be left to academia? I think that, to answer that last question, I think that it is helpful to expose students to neuroscience, maybe a little bit more than just an adjunct to biology as they go through high school. I know that there are interventions to kind of expose kids to neuroscience learning that are a little bit more outside the classroom. I don't know that I would have more than like a course if I were to make a hard requirement. Like, I don't think people need to delve into it really hardcore. And I think that neuroscience can be learned sort of in different ways. Like, you could learn about it through a cognitive science course. You could learn about it through a psychology course that leans into the bio more. You could learn about it through a biology course. So there are multiple avenues through which it can happen. To answer the other question about views, I think that neuroscience has changed my views about some things. Maybe my viewpoints about like more, I don't know, like things that people would consider like more mystical beliefs had been kind of attenuated by seeing how the brain actually works, because I think that people can believe a lot of stuff that is a little bit outlandish when they don't know about how a system works, basically treating the brain like a black box. Learning more about how it actually operates was both enlightening, but also a little bit like, it's to some people, it's like spoiling the magic a bit. But at the same time, we don't want to like go about our lives operating on some sort of belief about stuff that isn't really how the world works. So I think that's one definite thing that had changed throughout my education. But as far as politics and philosophy, I'd say that the bigger changes had happened more so in starting to work at Occidental, just because I was more aware of how to connect neuroscience to more left-leaning perspectives. So some of that has been an interesting journey, just because, I don't know, it just pointed out some oversights in what my regular training was as I was going through my graduate schooling and postdoc, things that maybe would be good for schools to integrate later on. Considering the diverse and interdisciplinary nature of cognitive science and neuroscience, can you provide some insight for students interested in these areas but uncertain about which major to choose? Which factors should they consider to make an informed decision. How do career prospects and research opportunities differ between them? And what advice would you offer to students trying to navigate these choices? So I do get the question when students are trying to figure out a major, what to gravitate to. Usually the comparison is between cognitive science and psychology. I think that going through the psych major is probably a lot more helpful if you're going to try to do clinical psychology, so applied practice in a more medical type setting, therapy, etc. Cognitive science is pretty broad. In fact, more broad than I would say neuroscience is. Neuroscience, you kind of can go a few different routes. You could go into research with people, so a lot of brain scan type stuff. You could go into some medical type route. You can also go into basic research with animal models, or you could even go into cellular or molecular neuroscience where you're not really working with whole animals anymore, where you're working with cells in a dish. So those are the usual routes. There's also computational neuroscience for folks that aren't really working in a wet lab per se, but instead mostly digitally. As for cognitive science, though, I think this question is something that I'll try to address through a sort of event that we're going to have in our department, where folks can meet alumni to see what they've actually gone on to do, because there are really a lot of different directions you can go based on cognitive science encompassing the umbrella of computation, language, philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, all of these things. So I hope to answer that question kind of more as we go on, but again, as far as some routes I've seen students go, I know that one route in particular I've seen some students go through cognitive science is speech-language pathology, where that's being applied to help people that have certain speech disorders. As far as career prospects, I think I did touch on this a little bit in my discussion. I think that this is also like potentially a little bit more of what your preferences are for me to guide what specific answers I can give. So I do suggest that when you have questions like this about potential career prospects, that you do talk with your professors and faculty to figure out what they think about, and then what jives with your particular preferences. How does neuroscience relate to psychiatry in terms of education? So I think that neuroscience gives a little bit more of a background as far as how we actually apply medication. Because for quite a while, we would just have some general ideas of, oh, well, we balance out these chemicals in the brain, it does this thing. So it was a little bit of a lag time before we actually had good neuroscience research to back up some of the perspectives of how this stuff worked in practice. Now, as far as education, sorry if I'm kind of misinterpreting the question a little bit. So I think that if we're talking about neuroscience as like a component of psychiatry or psychology, I think that's a necessary component under both of those umbrellas, that you have to learn about the biology in order to learn about the brain. An example would be that I was teaching over a few summers this biopsychology class for graduate clinical psychology students. And they hadn't really had bio classes much before like graduating, let's say. They'd have like the required bio course in their psychology curriculum, and then that would be it. So I think that there needs to be a little bit more than that. Certainly a refresher was needed for a lot of students. They were a little bit scared of going back to bio, for instance, because it had been so long, and because it's not really brought into clinical practice as much as it should be, or at least the knowledge of how these things work, as evidenced by our discussion of that paper about the serotonin hypothesis of depression. As someone in the neuroscience field, how do you integrate new technologies and findings into what you are currently studying? Has there ever been a time where you wanted to study something, but the new information has come out that rendered the subject unnecessary to spend time on? I think that if a project takes a really long time, the technology can outpace it so that you could do something in a much cleaner way. That probably applied for one of the studies that I had published not too long ago, 2020, I believe, my optogenetics study. And In that case, even though optogenetics is kind of on like the leading edge of newer stuff, there were better ways in order to actually analyze the brain regions to study specific cell populations there that in theory I could have tapped into, but I probably would have been doing my postdoc for at least another year or two, and that was not something I was really up for doing. As far as integrating new technologies, some of it does require funding flexibility. So if there are certain things that you'd like to integrate, but they're too expensive because they're new, cutting edge, and they're not just being openly shared, I think that is a definite hurdle. So there are a lot of labs around the world, certainly outside the US, that don't have access to these technologies for either funding reasons or other reasons. And so I think that it's important for a lot of these technologies to be made less expensive and less technical so that they can be applied to other labs and so that they can kind of also bolster their own research efforts so that it's not so US dominated. What was the most interesting research topic you have seen in neuroscience? I would say, honestly, I do think that the ones trying to analyze how consciousness work, that's sort of an interesting line of analysis. It's something I'm only so knowledgeable in because I don't do brain scan research, so I basically get the gist of the networks they're analyzing, the general stuff about the techniques, but I don't have a full scope of like everything having to do with consciousness. I do think that trying to delve into having brain scans to analyze where people are consciousness-wise is an interesting intervention that can be really helpful for, I don't know, trying to recover people that are in these coma or coma-like states. Maybe another interesting topic that has come to mind is, I think I mentioned in my discussion in that class period, the intersection of probiotics, immune system, and the brain, and I think that there's still a lot to be researched there. Tons and tons to be researched. It's just that there's so many factors that it becomes hard to keep straight all of them and figure everything out. All right, so that was it for the posted questions after our session. Hopefully this has been informative, but people should feel free to reach out to me or other faculty in CogSci or neuroscience minor faculty, whichever, if you have follow-up questions to these.